had always considered myself a mother first. Everything else, my own dreams, my personal desires, even my own well-being at times, a distant secondary consideration, willingly, almost eagerly relegated to the background in the grand, all-consuming opera of parenthood. My life, particularly in the 15 tumultuous, challenging, yet undeniably precious years since my son Max had blessed our small, often struggling world with his bright, boisterous presence, had been an unwavering, almost monastic testament to that all-consuming, self-sacrificing devotion. I had willingly, almost eagerly set aside my own nascent career dreams. A fledgling catering business, I had once poured my heart and soul into a small, hopeful venture that had shown early promise but required an investment of time and energy I simply couldn't sustain alongside the relentless demands of single motherhood. I had curtailed my social life until it was virtually non-existent, traded leisurely weekend brunches with friends for bleary-eyed early morning soccer practices, swapped evenings spent curled up with a good book for nights spent patiently helping with frustrating math homework, or soothing away the anxieties of a sensitive teenage boy navigating the treacherous waters of adolescence. I had done all of this and so much more without complaint, without resentment, fueled by a fierce, primal, and unconditional love for my son, ensuring he had everything he could possibly need, everything I could possibly humanly provide, often stretching myself and our perpetually strained modest finances to their absolute, often painful breaking point. But when the day finally devastatingly arrived, a day that began like any other ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday, but would end with my carefully constructed world lying in shattered, unrecognizable ruins around me, the day he, my own child, Max, the very radiant center of my entire universe, the sole, cherished recipient of my every waking thought and tireless, unceasing effort, looked me squarely, unflinchingly in the eye during a heated, increasingly bitter adolescent argument over something as trivial as a less-than-stellar report card, and spat out the words with a casual, unthinking cruelty that stole the very breath from my lungs. "You're a failure, Mom. A complete and utter failure. All you ever do is work those stupid dead-end jobs, and it's never, ever enough. Look at us. Look at this crappy apartment. Look at me." Don't you ever get tired of being such a loser? My heart, that resilient, endlessly forgiving, battle-scarred mother's heart, didn't just break. It felt as though it had been violently, irrevocably shattered into a million jagged, razor-sharp, unrecoverable pieces. My own child, the boy I had poured my entire existence into nurturing, into protecting, into providing for, saw me, his mother, not as a provider, not as a protector, not as a source of unwavering, unconditional love and support, but as a failure, a loser. The pain of those two carelessly, callously flung words was unbearable. A corrosive, searing acid eating away at the very foundations of my being, at my sense of self-worth, at everything I had ever believed myself to be. But even in that profound, suffocating abyss of maternal despair, as the initial shockwave of raw, agonizing hurt began to subside, a tiny, defiant, almost imperceptible spark ignited within the deepest, most wounded part of me. I wasn't going to let his youthful ignorance, his momentary, albeit devastating cruelty define me. I wouldn't let it define our relationship. I certainly wouldn't let it define the sum total of my life's work, my life's sacrifices. I was going to teach him with a love as fierce and unyielding as the profound pain he had just so casually, so carelessly inflicted, the profound, enduring, and absolutely essential value of gratitude, of respect, of understanding, the silent, often invisible, and almost always unacknowledged sacrifices that underpin a family's well-being, a child's future. I decided in that moment of profound, soul-crushing anguish to turn this deeply personal, agonizingly painful, and humiliating moment into a life lesson, a crucible that would, I prayed, forge his character, shape his future for the better, and perhaps, just perhaps in the process, mend the fractured, bleeding pieces of my own wounded, weary heart. What happened next? Well, let's just say it was a lesson, a long, arduous, and deeply transformative journey that Max, and indeed I, his supposed failure of a mother, would never, ever forget. My name is Rachel Miller. In what now feels like another lifetime, a lifetime viewed through the soft, hazy, and often misleadingly romantic filter of youthful memory. A lifetime filled with the vibrant, hopeful, almost incandescent hues of burgeoning ambition and unbridled optimism. I had dreamed quite vividly of being a writer. Not just any writer, but a journalist perhaps, a foreign correspondent, even someone who could weave words into powerful, impactful stories that mattered, stories that resonated deeply, stories that perhaps, just perhaps, even changed the world in some small, incremental but meaningful way. I had a degree in English literature from a respectable, if not Ivy League university, a burning passion for language and storytelling, and a worn, leather-bound portfolio filled with promising, if largely unpublished short stories, insightful essays, and a few fledgling articles I had managed to get published in obscure, small-circulation literary magazines. But then, during my final year of college, I met Michael Carter Max's father. Our love, or what I had then so fervently, so naively believed to be love, was a whirlwind. Intense, passionate, all-consuming. He was charming, ambitious, with a quick wit and a disarming smile that could, and often did, melt my defenses. He spoke of a future filled with shared dreams, with adventure, with success. And very quickly, far too quickly in retrospect, before my own carefully laid career plans had even had a chance to fully blossom, before I had even truly begun to test my own wings in the professional world, I found myself a young wife, and then just as quickly, almost breathlessly, a young and somewhat overwhelmed mother to our beautiful, colicky, and utterly adored baby boy Max. Michael, while initially charming and seemingly supportive during the early sleep-deprived days of Max's infancy, soon proved to be less than steadfast, less than committed to the often unglamorous, relentlessly demanding realities of parenthood and a shared domestic life. His own career ambitions, his restless, almost nomadic spirit, soon led him down a different, more solitary path. A path that diverged sharply and painfully from the quiet, often isolating domestic life I was trying, with increasing desperation, to build and maintain for our small fledgling family. Our divorce, when Max was just a bewildered, sensitive 5-year-old, was on the surface at least relatively amicable, largely because I, in my exhaustion and my desperate desire to shield Max from further emotional turmoil, conceded to most of Michael's terms, asking for little for myself beyond a modest and often unreliable child support agreement. He moved across the country shortly thereafter, ostensibly for a can't-miss career opportunity. His presence in Max's life dwindling rapidly from infrequent weekend visits to even more infrequent perfunctory birthday and holiday phone calls, eventually fading almost entirely into the realm of a distant, almost mythical, and largely absent figure. And so, I became a single mother solely and entirely responsible for the emotional, physical, and increasingly the financial well-being of our young son. My dreams of a literary career, already relegated to the dusty back burner of my mind, were now, I realized with a heavy, pragmatic sigh, effectively and perhaps permanently extinguished, replaced by the far more pressing, far more practical, and far less romantic realities of daily survival, of putting food on our table, of keeping a roof over our heads, of ensuring Max had everything he needed to thrive, or at least to not feel the sharp, stinging deprivations of a life lived on the precarious edge of financial insecurity. I took on a series of jobs, whatever I could find, that would allow me the necessary flexibility to care for Max, to be there for his school events, for his doctor's appointments, for the inevitable childhood illnesses. I worked as a part-time administrative assistant at a local chaotic doctor's office in the mornings, my days filled with ringing phones, mountains of paperwork, and the often unpleasant task of dealing with anxious, irritable patients. In the afternoons, after picking Max up from school, I would rush home to help him with his homework, to prepare dinner, to manage the endless cycle of household chores. And then, 3 or 4 evenings a week, after tucking Max into bed with a story and a kiss, I would head out again to my second job, a physically demanding, often soul-crushingly tedious evening shift, stocking shelves at a large, impersonal 24-hour supermarket on the outskirts of town. My life became a relentless, exhausting blur of work, childcare, and domestic drudgery, a never-ending tightrope walk between making ends meet and trying desperately to carve out a few precious, fleeting moments of genuine connection with my son. There was no time, no energy, no mental space left for my own needs, my own desires, my own long-forgotten dreams. Every ounce of my being, every decision I made, every sacrifice I endured was for Max. To ensure he had a stable home, a good education, a semblance of a normal, happy childhood despite the absence of his father, despite our often straitened financial circumstances. I shielded him as best I could from the harsh realities of our struggles, always presenting a brave, cheerful, and capable facade, even when on the inside I was crumbling with exhaustion, with worry, with a profound, aching loneliness. I rarely, if ever, complained. I rarely, if ever, asked for help. I simply endured for him. And he, my Max, my beautiful, bright, and increasingly observant son, grew. He grew into a typical teenager navigating the hormonal minefields, the peer pressures, the academic stresses of high school. He was for the most part a good kid, intelligent, athletic, with a quick wit and a circle of boisterous friends. But he was also increasingly a teenager with all the attendant mood swings, the burgeoning desire for independence, the occasional flashes of sullen resentment, the almost obligatory age-appropriate belief that his mother, however well-intentioned, simply didn't and couldn't possibly understand him or his world. I tried, as I always had, to be patient, to be understanding, to give him space when he needed it, to be a steadfast, listening presence when he chose to share. I continued to work my 2, sometimes 3 jobs, the physical toll becoming more pronounced with each passing year. The lines of fatigue etching themselves more deeply around my eyes, the silver threads in my hair multiplying at an alarming rate. I continued to ensure our small rented apartment was clean, comfortable, a safe haven for him. I continued to cook nutritious meals, to wash his endless piles of laundry, to attend his parent-teacher conferences, where his grades, I noted, with a growing private concern, had begun a slow, steady decline, to cheer him on with a forced, bright enthusiasm I often didn't feel from the sidelines of his infrequent, uninspired appearances on the junior varsity soccer field. I thought in my maternal naivete that he saw, that he understood at least on some level the depth of my sacrifice, the relentless, uncomplaining effort that went into maintaining our small, fragile world. I never explicitly enumerated my hardships, never indulged in self-pity, never used my sacrifices as a weapon to guilt-trip him. I simply did what needed to be done for him, because he was my son, and I loved him more than life itself. Max, my now 15-year-old son, was, as I mentioned, navigating the notoriously turbulent, emotionally charged waters of adolescence. He was no longer the sweet, openly affectionate little boy who would race into my arms after school, his face alight with stories of his day. He was transforming, almost before my weary eyes, into a lanky, sometimes sullen, often monosyllabic teenager, a creature of hoodies pulled low over his eyes, of perpetually plugged-in earbuds from which tinny, indecipherable music constantly blared, of bedroom doors kept firmly, almost defiantly closed for hours on end. This I knew, or at least I tried to reassure myself, was a normal, if somewhat painful for me, part of the process of him forging his own identity, of him striving for independence, of him separating, as all healthy adolescents must, from his primary caregiver, me. But lately, his usual teenage angst, his periodic flashes of irritability, had seemed to morph into something more persistent, more pointed. He had become increasingly critical of our modest lifestyle, of our small, slightly shabby rented apartment in a less than fashionable part of town. He would make disparaging offhand comments about the second-hand clothes I carefully sourced for him from thrift stores, about the aging, unreliable family car. Tom, my husband in this version, is still present, but perhaps ineffectual or equally struggling financially, making Rachel's burden a shared one. though she carries more of the emotional and domestic load, and I shared about the fact that we couldn't afford the latest gaming consoles or the designer sneakers that his more affluent friends so casually flaunted. These comments, though often delivered with a teenager's characteristic lack of filter, still stung, each one a small, sharp pinprick to my already overstretched maternal heart. I understood on an intellectual level that he was likely feeling the intense pressures of adolescent peer comparison, the desire to fit in to possess the material trappings of a perceived cooler existence. But on an emotional level, his words often felt like a direct personal repudiation of all my relentless backbreaking efforts, of all the silent, unseen sacrifices Tom and I were making daily just to keep our family afloat, just to provide him with the necessities, let alone the luxuries he now seemed to crave. The argument that finally devastatingly led to his soul-crushing pronouncement began as so many family conflicts do over something seemingly trivial: his latest school report card. It wasn't just a single bad grade, it was a constellation of them, C's and D's littering a page that had just a year or two prior been a source of quiet pride filled with mostly A's and B's. His teachers in their appended comments had expressed concerns about his lack of engagement in class, his frequently missing homework assignments, his generally apathetic attitude towards his studies. I had tried initially to approach the subject calmly, to have a rational, supportive conversation. Max, honey, I'd begun sitting down with him at our small kitchen table after dinner, the offending report card lying between us like an unexploded landmine. We need to talk about these grades, what's been going on at school. Are you struggling with something? Is there anything I or your father can do to help? His reaction was immediate, defensive, almost explosive. Oh, here we go again, he'd sneered, pushing his chair back abruptly, his arms crossed defiantly over his chest, his eyes a startlingly vivid blue, so like his absent father's, now narrowed with a sullen resentment. It's always about the grades, isn't it? It's never about what I want, what I feel. You just don't get it, Mom. You never get it, Max. That's not fair, I'd replied, trying to keep my own rising frustration in check, trying to remember all the parenting articles I'd read about active listening and validating teenage emotions. Of course, I care about how you feel, but your education, your future, that matters too. These grades, they're not just numbers on a page, Max. They represent effort, or lack thereof. They represent opportunities or doors potentially closing. All I want, all your father and I have ever wanted, is for you to have the best possible chance in life, to have options, to be able to pursue your own dreams, whatever they may be. My dreams. He'd scoffed, a bitter, sarcastic edge to his voice that was so unlike my usually sweet-natured boy. What do you know about dreams, Mom? You haven't had a dream in like forever. All you do is work those two stupid dead-end jobs day in, day out. You're always tired, you're always stressed. You never have any money for anything cool. We live in this crappy little apartment. I have to wear hand-me-down sneakers. What kind of life is that? What kind of future are you even preparing me for? One just like yours. His words, each one a carefully aimed, poison-tipped dart, found their mark with unerring, devastating accuracy. They struck at the very heart of my deepest insecurities, my most private griefs, my most carefully concealed sacrifices. The years of exhaustion, the deferred dreams, the constant financial anxiety, the quiet shame of not being able to provide Max with the kind of material comforts his friends so effortlessly enjoyed. It all came crashing down upon me in that single, brutal adolescent indictment. I remember trying to reason with him, my voice trembling, my own carefully constructed composure beginning to fray. Max, that's incredibly unfair, and you know it. Your father and I, we work as hard as we possibly can to give you everything you need. Maybe not always everything you want, but everything you truly need. This apartment, it's clean, it's safe, it's our home. Your clothes are always clean. You always have food on the table. You have our love, our support. But he wasn't listening. He was lost in his own vortex of teenage angst, of perceived deprivation, of a profound, self-absorbed inability to see beyond his own immediate frustrations. Love and support don't pay for new Jordans, Mom, he'd yelled, his voice cracking now, with a mixture of adolescent fury and a dawning, perhaps even for him, uncomfortable awareness of his own cruelty. Love and support don't get you into the cool crowd at school. All my friends, their parents have real jobs, successful careers. They have nice houses, new cars. What do you have, Mom? What have you ever actually achieved? And then came the final devastating, soul-shattering blow. He stood up, his lanky teenage frame towering over me as I sat stunned and speechless at the kitchen table. He looked down at me, his eyes, those beautiful blue eyes I had once gazed into with such overwhelming love and hope, now filled with a cold, almost contemptuous disdain. "You're a failure, Mom." He stated, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, each word a perfectly formed, perfectly aimed, and perfectly lethal projectile. A complete and utter failure. All you ever do is work those stupid, dead-end minimum wage jobs, and it's never, ever enough. Look at us. Look at this crappy, cramped apartment. Look at me. Don't you ever get tired of being such a loser? Because I'm tired of having a loser for a mom. The words hung in the suddenly deathly still air of our small kitchen, a vile, viscous poison. He didn't shout them. He didn't scream them. He delivered them with a chilling, almost clinical precision, a precision that made them all the more devastating, all the more unendurable. I froze. My heart, that resilient, endlessly forgiving, battle-scarred mother's heart, didn't just break. It felt as though it had been violently, irrevocably shattered into a million jagged, razor-sharp, unrecoverable pieces. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even think. The world, my carefully constructed, sacrificially maintained world, seemed to tilt, to spin, to dissolve into a meaningless, agonizing blur of pain and disbelief. My own child. The boy I had poured my entire existence into nurturing, into protecting, into providing for the boy for whom I had willingly, uncomplainingly set aside every personal dream, every ambition, every desire. He saw me, his mother, not as a provider, not as a protector, not as a source of unwavering, unconditional love and tireless support, but as a failure, a loser. The silence that descended upon our small kitchen after his pronouncement was a living entity, thick, suffocating, charged with the unbearable weight of his casual, devastating cruelty. Max perhaps finally belatedly registering the profound, almost cataclysmic impact of his words. The look of utter shell-shocked devastation on my face seemed to falter for a moment. A flicker of something, confusion, regret, fear, crossed his own features, but then with a final defiant toss of his head, a mumbled, "Whatever." He turned on his heel and stormed out of the kitchen, retreating into the angry, isolating sanctuary of his closed bedroom door, leaving me alone adrift in the echoing, soul-destroying silence of his devastating, life-altering judgment. My world as I had known it had just ended. The slam of Max's bedroom door echoed through our small apartment with the finality of a gunshot, each reverberation a fresh, agonizing stab to my already bleeding, fractured heart. I remained frozen at the kitchen table, the remnants of our uneaten dinner growing cold before me. The harsh, cruel words he had flung with such casual, devastating precision. Failure, loser. Replaying themselves in an endless, tormenting loop within the stunned, silent chambers of my mind. It felt as if the very air had been sucked from the room, leaving me gasping, drowning in an ocean of disbelief, of profound, almost unbearable maternal pain. How had it come to this? How had my son, my sweet, once-loving Max, the boy whose every scraped knee I had kissed better, whose every childhood fear I had soothed with gentle lullabies and whispered reassurances, whose every small triumph I had celebrated with an almost embarrassing, effusive pride, how had he come to see me, his mother, with such cold, unadulterated contempt? The question gnawed at me, a venomous serpent coiling around my soul, its fangs dripping with the poison of self-doubt, of regret, of a despair so profound it threatened to consume me entirely. The hours that followed were a descent into a private, personal hell. Tom, my husband, who had been out for a rare evening meeting with a potential client for his struggling freelance architectural consultancy. Another layer of financial stress that constantly hummed beneath the surface of our lives. Another burden I tried to shield Max from, returned home late, to find me still sitting at that same kitchen table. A ghostly, silent figure in the dim, pre-dawn light, staring blankly at a wall, the untouched dinner plates a stark, accusing testament to the evening's devastation. He took one look at my tear-ravaged face, at the almost catatonic despair in my eyes, and his own, usually so calm and steady features, creased with an immediate, profound concern. "Rachel, my God, what happened? What's wrong?" he'd whispered, rushing to my side, his hand warm and comforting, gently touching my cold, trembling shoulder. And then, the carefully constructed dam of my composure, the one I had somehow managed to maintain in Max's dismissive, angry presence, finally catastrophically broke. The whole sordid, heartbreaking story poured out of me in a torrent of choked, incoherent sobs of anguished, fragmented sentences. Max's failing grades, my attempts at a calm discussion, his escalating anger, his bitter accusations about our modest lifestyle, his cruel, dismissive comparisons to his more affluent friends. And then those final devastating words. Failure. Loser. Tom listened, his arm a strong, steady anchor around my shaking shoulders, his initial expression of concerned bewilderment slowly, inexorably morphing into one of quiet, simmering anger, then into a deep, palpable sorrow, not just for me, but for Max, for the profound, unthinking cruelty of our son's adolescent outburst. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't try to minimize my pain or excuse Max's behavior with the usual tired tropes about teenage hormones or just a phase. He simply held me, letting me weep, letting me vent the full agonizing force of my maternal grief, my profound sense of betrayal, my crushing soul-deep despair. "He didn't mean it, Rach," Tom murmured, finally, his voice thick with a shared, if different, pain, stroking my hair with a tenderness that brought fresh tears to my eyes. "Not really. Not deep down. He's a kid, a confused, frustrated, and right now a very foolish, very cruel kid. He's lashing out. He's unhappy with himself, with his own struggles at school, with the pressures he's feeling from his friends, and he's taking it out on you, the safest, most convenient target, because he knows on some level that you'll still love him no matter what. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it okay." It was a despicable, unforgivable thing for him to say. But it's not the truth, Rachel. You are the furthest thing from a failure. You are the strongest, most dedicated, most loving mother I know. You are the bedrock of this family. His words, though spoken with such heartfelt, unwavering conviction, offered little solace in that initial raw abyss of my despair. They felt like distant, well-intentioned echoes, unable to penetrate the thick, suffocating fog of Max's devastating pronouncement. All I could hear, all I could feel, was the searing, branding iron imprint of those two words, failure, loser. Sleep that night, and for many nights that followed, was an elusive, tormented stranger. I would lie awake for hours, staring at the darkened ceiling of our small bedroom, the shadows seeming to writhe and mock me, Max's cruel words replaying themselves with an almost sadistic, relentless clarity. I dissected every moment of his childhood, every parenting decision I had ever made, searching desperately for the misstep, for the critical error, for the point at which I had so clearly, so catastrophically failed him in his own newly judgmental eyes. Had I worked too much, been too tired, too stressed, too often, absent even when physically present from his young life? Had my own unfulfilled dreams, my own quiet, simmering frustrations with our often precarious financial situation, somehow seeped into the atmosphere of our home, poisoning his perception of me, of our family, of his own prospects? Had I, in my desperate efforts to provide for him, to shield him from the harshest realities of our struggles, inadvertently created a child who was entitled, ungrateful, and utterly oblivious to the true value of hard work, of sacrifice, of a mother's unwavering, unconditional love? The questions gnawed at me, relentless, unanswerable. Each one a fresh wave of guilt, of self-recrimination, of profound, almost unbearable maternal anguish. I replayed with an almost masochistic intensity every instance where I had perhaps been too lenient or too strict. Every time I had said no to an expensive, unnecessary teenage whim, and every time I had, against my better judgment and our strained budget, said yes, just to see a fleeting smile on his increasingly sullen face. Had I spoiled him? Had I neglected him? Had I, in my all-consuming, often overwhelming efforts to simply keep our heads above water, somehow catastrophically failed to instill in him the fundamental values of gratitude, of respect, of empathy? The self-doubt was a corrosive acid eating away at my already fractured confidence, at my very sense of self as a mother, as a woman. I found myself withdrawing, retreating into a shell of quiet, aching sorrow. The easy laughter that had once characterized our home, however modest, vanished, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence, broken only by the mundane, necessary sounds of daily life. My interactions with Max became strained, stilted, filled with unspoken accusations and unexpressed pain. He, for his part, seemed to be existing in his own bubble of sullen adolescent resentment, alternating between monosyllabic grunts and an almost aggressive avoidance of any meaningful conversation, particularly with me. He would eat his meals quickly, silently, his eyes fixed on his phone, then retreat immediately to the isolating sanctuary of his closed bedroom door, the muffled sounds of violent video games or angry, indecipherable music seeping out from beneath it like a toxic miasma. Tom, my dear patient. Tom tried his best to bridge the widening, icy chasm between us, to mediate, to offer comfort and counsel to both his wounded wife and his confused, angry son. He would have long hushed, and I suspected often frustrating conversations with Max behind that closed bedroom door, conversations from which Max would emerge looking even more sullen, more withdrawn, his resentment now tinged with a defensive, almost defiant truculence. Tom would then return to me, his face etched with weariness, with a shared, helpless sorrow, reporting that Max was just being a teenager, that he was confused and lashing out, that he didn't really mean what he said, that he would eventually come around. But eventually, I knew wasn't good enough. The wound Max had inflicted was too deep, too raw, too fundamental to simply be left to fester, to hopefully vaguely heal on its own with the passage of time. His words, however impulsively, however cruelly spoken in the heat of adolescent anger, had revealed a profound, disturbing disconnect. A fundamental lack of understanding, of empathy, of basic human gratitude that I, as his mother, would not simply ignore or excuse away as just a phase. After several days, perhaps even a week, spent adrift in that suffocating, isolating fog of profound maternal grief and almost paralyzing self-doubt, something within me, some deeply buried, resilient core, began to stir, to push back against the encroaching darkness. The initial incapacitating shockwave of Max's cruel pronouncement had by no means fully subsided. The wound was still raw, still bleeding, still agonizingly tender to the slightest touch. But through the haze of pain, a new, albeit fragile clarity began to emerge. I started to look beyond my own wounded feelings, beyond the immediate personal sting of his words, and began to try with a more objective analytical mind to understand the potential underlying causes, the deeper, perhaps more complex roots of Max's outburst, of his apparent contempt for me, for our life. Was it truly solely about my perceived failures as a provider, as a mother, or were there other less obvious but equally potent factors at play? I forced myself to consider with a painful honesty the world Max was navigating every single day. The highly competitive, often materialistic, and relentlessly image-conscious environment of a modern American high school. He was surrounded, I knew, by peers from far more affluent families, teenagers who casually flaunted designer clothes, the latest expensive gadgets, brand new cars on their 16th birthdays, exotic spring break vacations to sun-drenched Instagrammable locales. our own modest, often financially strained existence, my two decidedly unglamorous service industry jobs, our small, slightly shabby rented apartment. These were, I had to admit, a stark and perhaps for him increasingly embarrassing contrast to the perceived ease and effortless abundance enjoyed by so many of his classmates. Had I, in my own quiet pride, in my determination to never appear a victim, to never burden him with our financial anxieties, inadvertently created an unrealistic expectation in him, a lack of true understanding of the value of a dollar earned, of the sacrifices required just to maintain our basic stability. Had my relentless efforts to shield him from the harshest realities of our often precarious situation backfired, fostering not gratitude, but a sense of entitled resentment when his desires, often fueled by peer pressure, and a teenager's natural yearning for acceptance, inevitably outstripped our limited resources. And then there was the undeniable, if often unspoken, influence of his absent father, Michael. While Michael was no longer a physical presence in our lives, his absence, his abdication of parental and financial responsibility, cast a long, lingering shadow. Max, I knew, though he rarely spoke of it, harbored a complex, often contradictory mix of emotions towards the father he barely knew. A yearning for connection, a simmering anger at his abandonment, perhaps even a subconscious desire to somehow emulate or at least understand the successful, if morally bankrupt man his father had appeared to be in those fleeting early childhood memories. Could Max's attack on my perceived failures be in some twisted, adolescent way a projection of his own unresolved anger, his own deep-seated disappointment with the father who had truly, undeniably failed him? These were difficult, uncomfortable questions that forced me to look beyond my own immediate pain and to confront some of my own potential, albeit unintentional, shortcomings as a parent. Perhaps I had been too focused on the practicalities of providing, on the relentless grind of working two jobs, and had in the process inadvertently neglected to instill in Max a deeper, more nuanced understanding of true success, of true worth values that transcended mere material possessions or societal status. Perhaps in my own exhaustion, I had failed to communicate effectively, to truly listen to his unspoken anxieties, his adolescent insecurities, his growing frustrations with a world that often seemed to value superficial appearances above all else. But alongside this dawning painful self-awareness, another far more empowering realization began to take root. Even if there were elements of truth in Max's cruelly delivered criticisms, even if I had in some ways inadvertently contributed to his current state of entitled discontent, his words, his judgment could not define me. I was not a failure. I was a survivor. I was a mother who had, against considerable odds, single-handedly raised a child, kept a roof over his head, food on his table, and who had, despite her own deferred dreams and profound personal sacrifices, never, ever stopped loving him, believing in him, striving for a better future for him. And it was this realization, this reclaiming of my own intrinsic worth, my own unshakable maternal identity, that finally decisively propelled me out of the paralyzing abyss of despair. I decided with a new, almost fierce clarity that I would not let Max's words, however deeply they had wounded me, be the final definitive statement on my life, on my motherhood. I would not allow him to continue to wallow in his own ignorance, his own ingratitude, his own distorted perception of reality. Nor would I resort to anger, to recrimination, to further alienating a son who was clearly in his own confused adolescent way also hurting. No, this was not a moment for punishment, for retribution, or for a further fracturing of our already strained relationship. This was, I now understood with a profound, almost revelatory certainty, a critical teachable moment, an opportunity to impart to Max one of life's most crucial, most fundamental, and often most painfully learned lessons. A lesson about empathy, about perspective, about the true, often hidden cost of the comforts he so casually took for granted. A lesson about the profound, enduring value of hard work, of sacrifice, of humility, and above all, of unconditional, unwavering familial love. I would not just tell him these things. I would somehow find a way to make him feel them, to understand them in a way that would resonate deep within his young, still malleable soul. My quiet, unassuming, and often invisible daily revolution of love and sacrifice was about to become a little less quiet, a little more visible, and a whole lot more educational. My plan, when it began to formulate in the quiet, determined corners of my mind, was not one of overt confrontation or punitive restriction. I knew from long, often frustrating experience that lecturing a 15-year-old, especially one as currently defensive and resentful as Max, was about as effective as trying to reason with a hurricane. No, if I wanted to reach him, to truly make him understand the depth of his misjudgment, the profound unfairness of his accusation, I needed a different approach, a more experiential, more immersive curriculum. I needed to subtly yet undeniably shift his perspective to allow him to walk, even for a short while, in a semblance of my own well-worn, often exhausting shoes. My strategy began to crystallize around two key interconnected components. First, a carefully orchestrated temporary but significant alteration in our household's financial realities, and second, a more direct, albeit still carefully managed exposure to the relentless, often invisible labor that underpinned his comfortable, taken-for-granted daily existence. The first phase of my educational initiative began subtly, almost imperceptibly. I didn't announce any drastic changes. I simply quietly began to implement a new, far more stringent household budget. The extras that Max had come to expect as his due, the weekly allowance that often seemed to evaporate within hours on frivolous purchases, the unlimited data plan on his smartphone, the readily available funds for impromptu outings with friends, the brand-name snacks and sodas that always magically appeared in our pantry. These things began to quietly and without specific explanation diminish, then disappear. When he first inevitably complained, "Mom, my phone's out of data again, and there are like no good snacks in the house," I responded not with anger or a lecture on his previous ingratitude, but with a calm, almost regretful explanation. "Oh, Max, honey, I'm so sorry. Things are a little tighter financially for us right now than usual. Your father and I made sure to include Tom to present a united if somewhat strained front, are having to make some difficult cutbacks for a while, just until things improve a bit. We all need to be a little more careful with our spending, a little more mindful of what's truly essential." His initial reaction, as expected, was one of frustration, of indignant disbelief. He grumbled, he sulked. He compared our suddenly impoverished state to the seemingly endless, effortless affluence of his friends' families. "This is so unfair. Mom, Josh's parents just bought him a new gaming laptop. And Sophie's going to Cancun for spring break, and I can't even afford extra data for my phone." I listened patiently, empathetically to his litany of adolescent woes, acknowledging his feelings of frustration, his perceived injustices. But I remained firm, gently but consistently, reiterating the new temporary financial realities of our household. "I understand it's frustrating, Max," I'd say, my voice calm, reasonable. "And I wish things were different right now, but sometimes life throws us curveballs. Sometimes we all have to make sacrifices to differentiate between our wants and our needs. It's a valuable lesson, sweetheart, though I know it doesn't feel like it at the moment." Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, then with a more dawning, uncomfortable awareness that temporary financial difficulties began to impact Max's own previously unexamined lifestyle. He had to start making choices. The daily gourmet coffee from the trendy cafe near his school, no longer an option, the latest must-have video game release. He'd have to save his own, now significantly reduced allowance for weeks or even months to afford it. The spontaneous weekend movie outings with friends he now had to politely decline or suggest a more budget-friendly alternative, like watching a movie at home. He even, to my secret, almost guilty satisfaction, had to start packing his own lunch for school on most days, as the cafeteria prices, he suddenly realized with a newfound personal acuity, were a total rip-off. The second and perhaps more impactful phase of my curriculum of reality involved a more direct, if still carefully orchestrated exposure to the sheer unyielding volume of domestic labor that I, and to a lesser extent Tom, performed daily labor he had for his entire 15 years largely blissfully and entirely ignored. One Saturday morning, I woke up feeling terribly unwell. My voice, a hoarse whisper, my movements slow, pained a theatrical performance worthy of a minor Oscar nomination. "Max, honey," I croaked from the depths of my armchair, a damp cloth artfully pressed to my forehead. I don't think I can manage today. My head is splitting. Everything aches. Could you possibly be a darling and just handle a few things around the house for me? Just for today." His initial reaction was one of mild annoyance, quickly masked by a teenager's grudging obligatory concern. "Oh, sure, Mom. What needs doing?" My list, delivered with a weak apologetic smile, was, I confess, deliberately comprehensively daunting. It included not just his own usual often neglected chores, tidying his disaster zone of a bedroom, taking out the overflowing trash and recycling, but also a significant portion of my regular Saturday workload, doing 3 loads of family laundry from sorting to folding to putting away, grocery shopping for the entire week, armed with a detailed list and a very strict budget, preparing lunch and dinner for himself and Tom, who I had conveniently arranged had an urgent all-day work commitment that Saturday, scrubbing the kitchen floor, cleaning both bathrooms, and as a final pièce de résistance, ironing a week's worth of Tom's notoriously difficult-to-press work shirts. Max's eyes widened with each new item added to the list, his initial casual, "Sure, Mom," slowly morphing into an expression of dawning, horrified comprehension. But, Mom, that's like a ton of stuff. That'll take me all day. I was supposed to go to the mall with Josh. "I know, sweetie. I'm so sorry to spoil your plans," I whispered, my voice laced with a carefully calibrated note of pathetic maternal helplessness. "But I really can't manage it today. And your father, well, you know how hopeless he is with laundry and ironing." A small white lie, perhaps, as Tom was perfectly capable if rarely called upon, but all in a good cause, I reasoned. And so Max's day as domestic CEO began. It was from my carefully concealed vantage point on the sofa, from which I observed his efforts through strategically cracked doors, and with feigned, sleepy disinterest, a masterclass in adolescent ineptitude, mounting frustration, and eventual dawning almost revelatory enlightenment. The laundry which he attempted first was a comedy of errors. Whites mixed with colors, a mysterious pink tinge appearing on all of Tom's formerly white undershirts, an entire load of delicates inadvertently shrunk to doll-sized proportions in the high-heat dryer. The grocery shopping expedition, armed with my detailed list and a calculator, took him nearly 3 agonizing hours, and he returned, flustered, exhausted, and still somehow having forgotten several key ingredients for the dinner he was now supposed to magically produce. His attempt at making a simple spaghetti bolognese for lunch resulted in a scorched pan, a kitchen counter splattered with tomato sauce, and a dish that was, by his own later sheepish admission, mostly inedible. The bathrooms, when he finally grudgingly tackled them, were given a cursory, ineffective swipe with a damp cloth, leaving streaks and a lingering odor of teenage resentment. And the ironing. Let's just say Tom's work shirts emerged from Max's inexpert ministrations, looking more creatively crumpled, more artistically creased than they had before he started. By late afternoon, Max was a wreck. He was tired, he was sweaty, he was frustrated, he was hungry, having subsisted mostly on a bag of stale chips he'd found in the back of the pantry, and he was, I could see, finally blessedly beginning to comprehend on a visceral, personal level the sheer, relentless, often thankless volume of work that went into the seemingly effortless, smooth running of our household, the work that I, his failure of a mother, performed day in, day out, year after year, without fanfare, without complaint, and apparently, until now, without his slightest recognition or appreciation. The true intended denouement of my carefully orchestrated life lesson, however, was yet to come. It was planned not as a moment of maternal triumph or "I told you so" smugness, but as a quiet, heartfelt, and hopefully transformative conversation. That Saturday evening, after Max had finally wearily collapsed onto the sofa, surrounded by the chaotic evidence of his day-long, largely unsuccessful domestic endeavors, a pile of still damp, strangely pink-tinged laundry, a grocery bag still containing several forgotten items, the lingering acrid scent of burnt tomato sauce emanating from the kitchen, I decided the time was right. I, miraculously, began to feel a little better, my splitting headache conveniently subsiding. I made us both a simple, comforting cup of tea, and then, with a quiet, gentle seriousness, I sat down beside him. He looked up at me, his usual teenage bravado entirely absent, replaced by a look of genuine, bone-deep exhaustion, and perhaps, just perhaps, a flicker of newfound grudging respect. "Mom," he said, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. Your job, it's really hard, like way harder than I thought." That was the opening I had been waiting for. Not to gloat, not to chastise, but to finally, truly connect. "Max." I began softly, my voice steady but filled with an emotion I no longer tried to conceal. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day, about me being a failure." And it hurt Max. It hurt more than words can possibly say. But I also realized that perhaps in some ways I had failed you, not in the ways you meant perhaps, but I had failed to truly show you, to make you understand the reality of my life, of our life, of the sacrifices that have been made willingly and lovingly for your sake, for your future. Max sat quietly, his gaze fixed on his hands now stained with indeterminate grime from his day of domestic warfare. He looked for the first time in a very long time, genuinely receptive, genuinely willing to listen. And so, I began to tell him my story. Not the edited, sanitized version I usually presented to the world, but the raw, unvarnished, often painful truth. I spoke of my own youthful dreams, the ambitions I had once held for a career in writing, the intellectual passions I had nurtured. I talked about meeting his father, about the early hopeful days of our marriage, about the joy of his own birth, a joy so profound it had eclipsed for a time all other aspirations. And then I spoke with a quiet, factual honesty that required all my courage about the slow, painful disintegration of my marriage to Michael, about his eventual abandonment, about the crushing, terrifying responsibility of suddenly finding myself a single mother, solely responsible for the well-being of a 5-year-old child with limited financial resources and an uncertain future. I didn't dwell on the bitterness or the anger towards his absent father. That was a separate, more complex conversation for another much later day. Instead, I focused on the practical realities, on the relentless daily struggle to simply keep us afloat. I described the series of low-paying, often soul-crushing jobs I had taken over the years. The early morning shifts at the bakery, smelling of yeast and exhaustion before the sun even rose. The mind-numbing data entry work I did from home late into the night after he was asleep. The physically demanding evening shifts stocking shelves at the cavernous impersonal supermarket, my feet aching, my back screaming, my mind replaying grocery lists and school permission slips. I explained how for years I had juggled 2, sometimes 3 part-time jobs simultaneously, a constant precarious balancing act, just to ensure there was always food on our table, a roof over our heads, clean clothes on his back, and enough money to cover his school fees, his doctor's visits, his occasional longed-for treats. I talked about the things I had given up, not with self-pity, but with a simple factual matter-of-factness. The books I no longer had time to read, the friendships that had withered from neglect, the hobbies, the small personal pleasures that had been indefinitely postponed, then eventually forgotten. I spoke of the constant gnawing anxiety about money, about unpaid bills, about the fear of an unexpected illness or a sudden car repair that could tip our fragile household into financial ruin. I described the shame I sometimes felt when comparing our modest circumstances to those of his more affluent friends, a shame I had always tried to hide from him, a shame that I now realized he had likely internalized and transformed into resentment towards me. And as I spoke, as I laid bare the unvarnished, often painful truth of my life, of the sacrifices I had made, not as a martyr, but simply as a mother, doing what needed to be done for the child she loved more than life itself, I saw a profound, almost shocking transformation begin to occur in Max. His initial sullen defensiveness slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to melt away. His gaze, which had been fixed on his hands, slowly lifted to meet mine. His eyes, those beautiful blue eyes, so like his father's, now wide, glistening no longer with anger or contempt, but with a dawning, horrified comprehension, with a burgeoning, almost unbearable empathy. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer excuses. He just listened. Truly deeply listened, perhaps for the very first time in his young life, to the unspoken symphony of his mother's sacrifices, to the unacknowledged narrative of her unwavering, all-consuming love. When I finally finished speaking, my voice hoarse, my throat tight with unshed tears, a heavy, profound silence filled our small living room. A silence that was no longer accusatory or strained, but filled with a new, fragile, and incredibly precious understanding. And then, Max, my tough, often aloof 15-year-old son, did something he hadn't done in years. He reached out his hand, still smudged with the day's grime, hesitantly, almost shyly covering mine, and he began to cry. Not the angry, frustrated tears of a thwarted teenager, but deep, shuddering, heartfelt sobs of genuine, profound remorse, of dawning, painful self-awareness. "Mom." He choked out his voice, thick, broken, almost unrecognizable. "Oh, Mom, I had no idea at all. I've been such a jerk, such an ungrateful, selfish, stupid jerk." He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "All those things I said, about you being a failure, about our apartment, about everything. I didn't mean them, Mom. Not really. I was just being stupid and mean and I didn't understand. I didn't understand anything." He looked up at me, then his face streaked with tears, his eyes, those beautiful blue eyes, now filled with an expression of such raw, unadulterated remorse, such profound, aching regret that it almost broke my heart anew. But this time in a strangely hopeful, almost cathartic way. "You're not a failure, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling with conviction. You're amazing. You're the strongest, most incredible person I know, and I'm so incredibly sorry for everything. Can you ever forgive me?" I pulled him into my arms, then my own tears finally freely flowing, mingling with his. I held him tightly, rocking him gently, just as I had done when he was a small, frightened child, and whispered into his hair, "Oh, Max, my sweet, foolish boy. Of course I forgive you. Of course. There's nothing to forgive, not really. You just didn't understand. But now I think you do." And in that moment, in that tearful, heartfelt embrace, in the shared vulnerability of that quiet Saturday evening, I knew with a certainty that resonated deep within my soul that we had turned a corner, a profound, life-altering corner. The ugly, painful words he had spoken, the words that had shattered my world, had paradoxically become the catalyst for a new, deeper, and far more authentic understanding between a mother and her son. The lesson forged in pain, delivered with love, had it seemed finally truly been learned. The change in Max following that emotionally charged transformative Saturday was not instantaneous. Not a magical overnight metamorphosis from a sullen, entitled teenager into a paragon of filial piety, but it was nonetheless profound, undeniable, and deeply, deeply heartening. It was as if a heavy, obscuring veil had been lifted from his eyes, allowing him to see me, to see our life, to see himself with a newfound clarity, a newfound empathy, a newfound and often endearingly awkward sense of gratitude. He didn't suddenly become a perfect, chore-loving angel. He was still, after all, a 15-year-old boy with all the attendant hormonal fluctuations, occasional bouts of moodiness, and an almost pathological aversion to tidying his own bedroom. But the sharp, dismissive, contemptuous edge that had characterized his recent behavior towards me vanished, replaced by a new, almost tender consideration, a genuine, if sometimes clumsily expressed appreciation for the myriad, often invisible things I did for him, for our family, every single day. He started without any prompting from me to actually say, "Thank you. Thank you for dinner, Mom, even if it was just simple pasta and a salad. Thank you for washing my soccer uniform. I know it was really muddy. Thank you for just being you, Mom." Those small, simple words, once so glaringly absent from our daily interactions, now felt like precious restorative balms to my previously wounded spirit. He also began again, entirely unprompted, to take on more responsibility around our small apartment. He started consistently taking out the trash and recycling without my having to remind him multiple times. He learned with a surprising, if somewhat chaotic enthusiasm, how to load and operate the dishwasher correctly. He even, on a few memorable occasions, offered to cook dinner, producing concoctions that were, while not always culinary masterpieces, his infamous experimental chili surprise, being a case in point, nonetheless offered and consumed with a shared, heartfelt warmth and a great deal of good-natured laughter. He started asking about our household budget, showing a genuine, if somewhat bewildered interest in how much things actually cost, in the careful, often stressful financial juggling act that had been my solitary burden for so long. He even, to my utter astonishment, started looking for a part-time weekend job at the local library to help out a bit Mom and to save up for those new sneakers myself. But the most significant, most deeply moving change was in his perception of me, in his understanding of my life, my sacrifices, my deferred dreams. He started asking me questions, real questions about my past, about my own aspirations before he was born, about the catering business I had once so passionately, so hopefully started. He listened, truly listened, with a new empathetic attentiveness, as I shared hesitantly at first, then with increasing openness. Some of my own long-buried hopes, my quiet frustrations, my unfulfilled ambitions. He even one afternoon, after finding one of my old dusty writing journals tucked away in a forgotten box in the attic, read a few of my youthful, angst-ridden short stories, and with a surprising, almost adult perceptiveness told me, "Mom, these are really good. You should write again. You're a really good writer." His words, so simple, so sincere, brought tears to my eyes, a validation I hadn't even realized I had been so desperately, so silently craving for so very long. Our relationship, which had been so strained, so fractured by his earlier outburst, began to heal, to mend, to transform into something even stronger, even deeper, even more authentic than it had ever been before. The wall of adolescent resentment and maternal hurt that had risen between us began to crumble, brick by painful brick, replaced by a new bridge of mutual understanding, respect, and a rediscovered, more mature affection. We talked more, laughed more, shared more. He was still a teenager, yes, with all the attendant complexities, but he was also now a young man who was beginning to see his mother not just as a provider of services, not just as an authority figure to be rebelled against, but as a human being, a woman with her own history, her own struggles, her own unfulfilled dreams, a woman who had quite simply given him her all. The lesson I realized wasn't just for Max, it was for me too. His cruel, unthinking words, however deeply they had wounded me at the time, had in a strange, paradoxical way been a catalyst, a wake-up call. They had forced me to confront my own silent, unacknowledged resentments, my own pattern of selfless, almost self-obliterating sacrifice. They had compelled me to finally truly articulate my own story, my own worth, not just to him, but, perhaps more importantly, to myself. I learned that while a mother's love is and should be unconditional, it does not and should not require the complete erasure of her own identity, her own needs, her own aspirations. I learned that sometimes the greatest gift we can give our children is not just our endless sacrifice, but also the example of a life lived with purpose, with passion, with a quiet, unshakable belief in one's own intrinsic value, even in the face of adversity, even in the absence of external validation. In the end, Max didn't just apologize for calling me a failure. He, through his own dawning understanding, through his own transformed perspective, helped me to see that I was anything but. I was a mother who had weathered storms, who had made impossible choices, who had loved fiercely, protectively, and unconditionally, and that I finally truly understood was the furthest thing from failure. It was, in fact, the very definition of a quiet, unheralded, but profoundly meaningful triumph. Our small, imperfect family, once teetering on the brink of a painful, irreparable schism, had found its way back not to the naive, untested happiness of the past, but to a new, more resilient, more authentic, and far more precious state of grace, a grace forged in the crucible of painful truth and cemented by the enduring transformative power of gratitude, understanding, and a love that even when tested to its absolute limits, had ultimately blessedly refused to break. The journey had been arduous, the lesson hard won, but the destination, this new landscape of mutual respect and deepened affection, was a reward beyond measure.